Joining me now is P Chidambaram, the former finance minister of the country who's leading the Congress charge on the issue. Appreciate your joining us, Mr. Chidambaram. In your press conference today, Mr. Chidambaram, you have focused on inflation, say it's going to be a major issue in this parliament session. The government's managers say, who is the Congress to lecture us on inflation? Inflation was much higher during the UPA years, especially between 2009 and 2014. Food inflation averaged 10% at the time. Fuel inflation was high. Who is the Congress to tell us about inflation? What about your years? Response, sir.
So the Congress won't talk about it. So who will talk about it? What is this whataboutery? 10 years ago, there was inflation, and therefore my inflation today is justified. This is the most ridiculous argument I hear from political parties. Yes, there was high inflation between 2009 and 2011, but it was brought under control in 2012 and 13. So what? We are not now evaluating the government of 2009 to 2012. We are evaluating the government that is in office today. So please answer, why is inflation so high? And why are you not taking steps, the visible, obvious steps to temper inflation? That's the question. This whataboutery must be put an end to, and I would request the media to put an end to whataboutery.
Let's put the whataboutery, as you call it, aside for a moment. Talk about solutions. You know, easier in the opposition than in the government. For example, you've said today the government is increasing the price of petrol, diesel and LPG in a manner that is unacceptable. The government's response at the end of the day, look, taxes fall under both state and centre. The state's responsibility, including opposition states, is as much as the centre. Don't blame us alone, is what the centre says, for creating this situation. Some of the Congress states which are also having very high fuel prices, why don't you cut state taxes as well? Why only the centre? Your response?
No way they can get away with this wrong argument. Centre imposes excise duty, states also imposes state taxes. Nobody is denying that. But the centre's taxes are more than the state. Let's assume one cancels the other. What about the cesses? On petrol, the cess is 33 rupees a litre. On diesel, the cess is 32 rupees a litre. A cess can be imposed only by the central government. The state government does not impose cesses. And this cess revenue goes entirely to the central government. It is not shared with the states. And every year, at the current rate of cesses, the central government is collecting 4.2 lakh crore rupees. 4,20,000 crore rupees. Now, how is that justified?
No,
Let's assume that the state excise and the central excise cancel each other. But what about the cesses?
So are you saying at a time when non-fuel revenues are down because growth has lowered during pandemic times, the solution lies that all cesses should be removed? Is that what you're saying as a solution? Remove all cesses on fuel?
I'm not saying that all the cesses should be removed in one stroke. Reduce the cess by at least 5 rupees on petrol and 5 rupees on diesel. Immediately there'll be relief to the people. And as your other revenues, non-petrol, non-diesel revenues increase, and you should look for opportunities to increase your other revenue, then reduce the cesses. Cesses are bad taxes. Cesses are usually imposed for a specific purpose, for a specific period. A cess can't be a general tax which is there forever and ever.
You know, Mr. Chidambaram, many believe though that the real solution here is to bring all fuel under the goods and service tax regime, and there has been a reluctance at the moment both from the centre as well as the opposition ruled states, because the fact is that fuel taxes are your cash cow. Do you believe that this is the right time to bring fuel under the goods and services tax regime?
Not under the present dispensation. There's a complete break of trust between the center and the states. The center is treating the GST Council with scant respect. The center has set up a committee of officers which is taking all the decisions. It is not even submitted to the GST Council for approval. It is submitted for information. So the states are at war with the center. BJP finance ministers are equally at war, but they dare not speak up. Every non-BJP finance minister says and has said that there is no trust bond between the center and the states. In such a situation, for the center to imagine that GST will apply to petrol and diesel is a pipe dream. But the Tamil Nadu finance minister said, half jokingly, half seriously, I won't agree to even an additional toothbrush being brought under GST, given the state of affairs in the GST Council. Toothbrushes are already under GST.
But
what are those points out to? Points to a complete breakdown of trust between the center and the states, and therefore this is not an opportune time to talk about bringing petrol and diesel.
But that is troubling, sir. That is troubling because eventually, surely that has to be the solution. Bringing fuel under a GST regime is perhaps the only way to ensure a rationalization of prices.
I agree. I said so in this morning press conference. I said so. I said eventually petrol products have to be brought under GST. But given the current complete breakdown of trust, I can't imagine that is feasible under this government.
No, you're saying that it's not feasible under this government. This government says that the policy of the UPA years is responsible for the fuel crisis or the fuel price crisis in part. The present government is still redeeming and paying for the oil bonds which your government issued during the UPA years. How do you respond?
Oil bonds is a very different issue. Question is, was it an off-budget, off-balance sheet borrowing or not? We didn't hide the fact that it was an off-budget, off-balance sheet borrowing. But every analyst knows that that oil bond amount has to be added to the fiscal deficit. We were not hiding it. There was nothing secret about it. The oil bonds were issued transparently. Money was raised on the oil bonds. The oil companies paid for it. And the center serviced that oil bond. But over a period of time, the oil bonds have been reduced. There was a little left over when the NDA government took over. And the NDA government has paid back the oil bonds. That story is over. Now, why are you imposing cesses today? Why are petrol and diesel prices at an all-time high? It is 101 rupees in Delhi, 106 rupees in Mumbai. When crude oil prices were $125 a barrel, we were giving petrol at 64 rupees and diesel at about 45 rupees or so. Now, when the crude oil prices today, this morning, are only $75, to be precise, $74.98. Why is petrol and diesel almost 1.5 times the price that prevailed in the UPA regime? There's no answer from the government.
No, the government is saying that please appreciate that oil prices are also slowly rising. The price of crude oil is now around $75, as you said, per barrel now. So that also is a concern that global fuel prices are beginning to rise once again.
Where is $75 and where is $125? We are talking about petrol and diesel prices that were prevailing when crude oil prices were $125 per barrel. Today we are at $75 a barrel. God forbid, if we reach $125, you charge more. But when it is $75, why are you charging 1.5 times the price of petrol and price of diesel that prevailed under the UPA regime? There is simply no answer, Rajdeep. There is simply no answer.
The answer, Mr. Chidambaram, that the Modi government is giving is that we are in the midst of a pandemic. Non-oil revenues have not picked up for this government. Growth has slowed down. This government therefore needs oil revenues to sustain expenditure. public expenditure.
But your government expenditure itself is questionable. For example, why did you give a tax rebate to the corporate sector of 1,45,000 crore? It was completely unnecessary. Look at the profits that people have made. Look at the number of dollar billionaires that India has produced in the last 2 years when the pandemic is raging. Look at the net worth of the top 10, 20, 30 business houses. Look at the market cap. Today I read that one big business house has claimed that it is a first generation business house which has touched a market cap of $100 billion US. And then last year you wrote off 4,50,000 crore of debt, bank loans to the corporate sector. So these are not small amounts. This is not petty cash. 1,45,000 crore tax rebate to the corporate sector, 4,50,000 crore bank loans written off. So there are other sources of revenue. And on top of this, you force the RBI to declare special dividends. And you've got a huge amount, something like 1,75,000 crore. Now, where is all this money going? Now, you don't tax the rich. You give away to the rich, the corporate sector, and you impose a regressive tax like GST, a regressive tax like cess on petrol. Indirect taxes, by definition, are regressive. It falls equally on the poor and the rich, and therefore, by definition, it is regressive. A progressive tax is income tax. A progressive tax is wealth tax. So you must explore opportunities to increase your direct tax revenues and give relief to the poor and the middle class by giving relief in the indirect taxes. That's all that we are pleading.
The government says, sir, they are using the revenues they are collecting from the fuel taxes to ensure, as I said, public expenditure through pro-poor schemes. Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, the Kisan Samman Yojana, that those whose incomes are hurting in pandemic times, the government is reaching out to them. They claim this is the fact that should be recognized, which the opposition isn't. How do you respond to that?
Less said about it, the better. The 20 lakh crore package which the Prime Minister announced and the Finance Minister rolled out in installments has been torn to pieces. The World Bank, IMF, economists have estimated that the real fiscal stimulus component of that 20 lakh crore was about 1.1% of GDP. I estimated, along with my colleagues, it was perhaps 1.3% of GDP. And the one that we announced a few weeks ago, it was announced in the morning and it vanished in the evening because it was a repetition of the earlier announcements. The additionality was barely 25,000 or 35,000 crore. What are we talking about? We're talking about countries giving a fiscal stimulus by direct cash transfer, by increasing pensions, by giving rebates on tax. Directly, you must transfer cash to the people. That, in India, the fiscal stimulus part of the so-called grand packages was no more than about 1.5% of GDP, which is a pittance.
You know, Mr. Chidambaram, listening to you, it's clear there are two views at the moment on the state of the economy. There are critics like you who are, or others who are saying we are heading towards stagflation, that growth has petered out. Government policy makers insist that we are now entering a V-shaped economy phase. The truth lies somewhere in between. Am I correct?
How many times have we heard about this V-shaped recovery? And I read a very interesting page in Kaushik Basu's latest book, a journal. He says, take any alphabet of the English language, you can always find an economist who says the recovery will be the shape of that alphabet. We've heard of B, we've heard of L, we've heard of T, we've heard of V, we've heard of W. So please put aside these shibboleths. Question is, what is recovery? I explained this morning. In 2019-20, at constant prices, we had a certain level of GDP, constant prices. In 2020-21, the first pandemic year, we dipped by huge negative, something like 23% or so. Now in 21-22, there will be a recovery because the base is a negative base. What IMF chief economists call a mathematical recovery, an arithmetical recovery, a statistical recovery. There will be a recovery. There will be a positive number. There are positive numbers because of a negative base in the previous year. The question is, will the GDP in constant prices in 21-22 cross the GDP of 19-20? When it crosses the GDP of 19-20, there is growth. But until it crosses the GDP of 19-20, there is no growth.
You know, listening to you, Mr. Chidambaram, there will be those who will ask, if everything is so bad, if fuel inflation is up as we accept, if jobs are being lost, which is true, if incomes are losing out in pandemic times, why don't we see greater anger of all of this on the streets from the Indian middle class? Clearly the Indian middle class seems to trust the Modi government that it will get its act together, or the opposition is unable to effectively translate Indian middle class anger into some kind of protest.
I have no answer to the question. You should put this to the Indian middle class. The Indian middle class has given up its vanguard position during the freedom struggle, during the great debate in the 1950s and 60s about what economic model India should follow, during the emergency, which was a bad patch, during Dr. Manmohan Singh's regime to some extent, the middle class was active, articulate, vocal. Now the middle class is completely silent. Now there could be many reasons. One, the pandemic. They are scared to come out and speak and participate in debate. There's very little debate going on, very little open debate because of the pandemic. Second could be fear. Even if a Disha Ravi, a student of Bangalore, puts out a tweet, she's thrown in prison for months. Therefore, there could be fear. The middle class is mortally feared of being arrested, thrown into jail, and denied bail for many weeks or many months. It could also be pandemic, it could be fear, it could be other reasons. You should ask the middle class. Why don't you assemble a group of middle class people and ask this question?
I'll give you a third reason. The third reason could be the state of the opposition. The credibility of the Congress and the opposition to really effectively speak out on these issues in a manner that you can convince people that you have a better model.
See, all I can speak for is the Congress party. We are doing our best. Our best may not be good enough. In your evaluation, our best may not be good enough. But we are protesting. We are in the streets. We hold demonstrations. In Punjab, they even slapped cases on people who had some buffaloes pull a car or something like that. We are addressing press conferences all over India today, tomorrow, day after. We are doing our best. The criticism that can be leveled against us, the best is not good enough. You should do more. That criticism I accept. And I will take it to my heart. We should do more. But the point is, unless the people see the writing on the wall. Now today, for example, the Prime Minister said, the third wave is imminent. Now what will happen if there is a third wave? The jobs lost in the first and second wave have not come back. The incomes and wages that were cut or reduced in the first and second wave have not come back. If there is a third wave, people will be hurt more. There will be more job losses, more income cuts, more wage cuts, more layoffs, more retrenchment. It will make it worse. So this is the time not only to take medical steps to prevent a third wave or to mitigate the effects of a third wave. It is time to take economic steps to mitigate the economic hardships of a third wave. But the government is clueless. The government is not even talking about economic preemptive steps to mitigate the effect of a third wave of the pandemic.
Let's leave it there, Mr. Chidambaram. It's always good to hear a voice who speaks from experience as finance minister. You're in the opposition, so perhaps you have every right to take on the government. We'll await a government response. But for now, thank you very much.